Hey everybody, today I wanted to discuss the difference between acute stress and chronic stress and why you should be embracing acute stress because we are, as humans, designed to thrive with acute stress. Now, let's talk a little bit about we'll go into why that is in a little bit, but first I wanted to discuss the difference between acute stress and chronic stress, understand why these things are so important, and then we'll go into a little bit of looking at it from all those different levels that we always talk about. Those levels, being physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, and sometimes the social aspect, which we're incorporating a little bit more than we have in the past. So it's Friday morning. I hope everyone has had a good week and is ready for the weekend. I know, speaking of acute stress, sometimes I think that the week is like this really acute stress in terms of all the work that needs to be done and all the responsibilities that we all have. And then on Saturday and Sunday, we can relax. Certainly, for me being Jewish, on Saturday is certainly our day of rest and when we cease doing any creative work. And that's the day for me to completely rehabilitate myself. I don't turn the computer on. I don't drive. I just am quiet and with family and community. And I get recharged on that day for the following week. And when we think about it from the idea of acute stress versus chronic stress, the difference between acute and chronic, just the words by themselves means obviously acute is sort of a sudden, singular, and has a beginning and an end. And then chronic, of course, being a long-term sort of thing. So we, for all of us, need to understand what the difference is between those in our own lives and our own situations. So let's start on the basic level, the physical level, and understand the difference between acute stress and chronic stress. And of course, when we're talking about physical, we can look at it from a nutritional perspective. We can look at it from a physical activity perspective, mainly those two things. And then we'll get into emotional as well in just a moment. So when we were talking about acute physical stress, that would be something like the difference between high intensity interval training and long-term chronic, I shouldn't call it chronic, but it is long-term, long-lasting aerobic exercise. So as an example, taking that particular example, when it comes to that high intensity interval training, where basically you're increasing for a short period of time the activity, and that doesn't mean you have to be sprinting. It could just mean that you're getting to a point where you're breathing heavier for a short period of time, and then you drop down and you walk, and then you do that 4 or 5 times, just a couple times a week. And that's been proven in many studies to be superior in terms of increasing the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood than doing long-term, 30-minute or 40-minute jogs where you're sort of running out of breath for that period of time. We also know that people who are engaged in this sort of long-term, I keep calling it chronic, but that's what it is, long-term aerobic exercise, we're finding that those people are not, it's better than nothing, but we're seeing that there's actually people who are doing it for a long period of time actually have some damage to the heart muscle because of this chronic long-term, thinking of the 80s when everyone was on the treadmill and running for 45 minutes a day or an hour a day. That is not a healthy way to exercise. A couple times a week of high-intensity interval training has been proven to outperform that in terms of the measure of overall physical conditioning. Same thing goes with lifting weights or doing resistance training. Definitely we need to be always using our muscles, but when someone actually wants to gain muscle, you really need to lift the heavier weights to create an acute stress on your body, on the muscles, that then can cause repair. Now, obviously we all need to be doing some sort of resistance training, and there should be a low level, which wouldn't be considered much of a stress, but something that you need to continually challenge yourself on, which is using your muscles on a regular basis. And that's why elastic bands are so important or I should say, are so easy to incorporate into your plan in general, because in when you use those, they're so easy to use. You could do it during the commercials, while you're watching TV, and it just primes your body. So it's not actually really a stress, but something that is required for our physical, uh, bodies to do. Okay, now let's move to nutritional. So what we found in nutritional science, is that acute stress is also, just like in terms of the acute stress of high intensity interval training and the acute stress of lifting heavy weights and actually damaging some of the muscles to then regrow stronger. We're seeing a similar thing in nutrition. And that's why there's a lot of interest now in fasting. And because when you are fasting, okay, there are things that are activated in your body to heighten your awareness, to activate chemicals in your body that are going to help you get through the fast, which also carry longevity benefits. But when that acute becomes chronic, for example, for someone who's on a very low, super low calorie diet, because they feel like they have to be on a low calorie diet to lose weight, then acute is no longer acute, it's chronic. So if you wanted to, so I bring this point up because there is a bit of a trend on these 1,200 calorie a day diets, and yes, they will cause you to lose weight, but in this case, you're tipping from, for most people, there are people who can exist and thrive actually on 1,200 a day, women who can thrive on 1,200 calorie a day diets. The majority of people are not going to thrive on that. They will lose weight, but you've just shifted your body from acute stress to chronic stress. And in that case, your body starts to decline. Your immune system functions. You can have increased cravings, increased anxiety has been reported when there is increased emotional lability. That's also been found when people lower the calorie counts to a too low of a level per day. So that's something that we need to be aware of. And I'll go into more depth about the amazing things that happen when you institute a fast during the day of a certain duration. I'll go into that most likely in a separate video, but remember that you don't then eat less than you normally would. You still need to recuperate those calories to maintain this so that it's not that the acute stress doesn't become a chronic stress. We get recycling of old cells in your body when you do fasting. And a lot of us are in this situation where we're chronically doing all kinds of, fasting. And when you're, as I said, when you're doing this fast, your body starts to recycle things. Old cells get recycled. But a lot of us are eating actually too frequently. Because when you're chronically eating, that shuts down that sort of breakdown of all these old cells. So there's a reason why we sort of evolved in a situation where there were periods of fasting and periods of feasting. And in some ways, we can recapture that with instituting sort of periods of fasting. I'm not recommending that until, because you really need to educate yourself to understand exactly what I'm saying, which is how to understand for yourself what's the difference between acute and chronic stress, how to make sure you're not shifting over into chronic stress when you're fasting. And mainly you do that by making sure you're getting enough hydration, you're getting a good amount of calories after the fasting period. A lot of people who fast tend to overeat. So there's a lot of balance that goes on with fasting, and that's definitely deserves another video for sure. Going up a level to emotional, when we all know, the saying, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," in a sense, is somewhat related to this. When we allow any emotional stress to not be acute, in other words, not to be resolved, or at least not to be, not for ourselves, not to react, learn how to understand our responses to stress when we are always being stressed by that. We haven't been able to figure out how, on an emotional level, we can deal with these things. Then then this emotional stress, which, if you've dealt with it, learned how to deal with it, and then moved on, you've become stronger. But if it becomes a chronic stress, then you will get the same physical symptoms that you're going to get from the nutritional or even physical chronic stress, which is decreased in immune function, and all kinds of different things. But your body is not good. It's not responsive to that. It's not a health or life promoting event. And so we need to be conscious of the emotional stresses that we have and whether we've allowed them to become chronic stresses, which can impact our overall health. On an intellectual level, this one's a little bit more difficult, I guess you could say, but what would be an intellectual stress? Well, if you are trying to learn something new, we should always be challenging ourselves intellectually, struggling with something, and sometimes just in life, trying to intellectually understand the situations in our lives can actually cause an enormous amount of stress that's separate from emotional stress. But obviously, we should always be challenging ourselves intellectually as well, learning things new, that we are, learning new things, and we don't want to make that turn into a chronic stress as well. Spiritually speaking, the same goes. We need to distinguish for ourselves the difference between acute and chronic stress. Acute stress, and actually, in Isaiah, it says that, I think it's Isaiah, he talks about the angels running and retreating, or it might be Ezekiel. And that sort of notion of running and retreating is something that in my tradition is associated with this concept that when we make spiritual leaps towards God and our relationship with God, while we can always have and be conscious of that relationship with the divine, when we go there or when we're in deep contemplation, we are not meant to stay there. We're meant to come back into the real world and implement on a very practical level. And so we've all met, I think most people have met in their lives, people who are, I can't remember the phrase, but it's something like spiritually high, but down to earth, no good, or something like that, where people get to such a high, or they feel such a high spiritual state that their mind's sort of in this, floating in this ethereal world. They're not grounded. And the concept in my tradition, as I said, is this notion of the angels running and returning, is that when we make these flights into spirit and to contemplation and prayer, and we need to always come back to earth, so to speak, and implement those things and be engaged in the world around us. Because if we are too grounded, one could look at that in a way as some kind of like a chronic stress. You're not making that leap. You're always down here. You're too engaged in the material world. Same thing goes for the people who are spiritually obsessed, I guess you could say, where they're always in these flights of mysticism and contemplation and meditation. And the Western path is one where we come back and we implement, and the Western path focuses more on this going, but also on this return and using the material world around us to implement and to refine and improve. And so you're never just here, there's this flight going back and forth. And one could look at that as in a way from the same perspective, where between, acute, you go to the other through meditation, prayer, contemplation, you make that leap, which can sometimes be a stress, and then you come back and you adapt. So we always need to be moving, and I think the concept here is that we always need to be challenging ourselves in some way. and determining for ourselves the difference between acute and chronic. And it goes through the whole sequence, every level that we have. Now, we could add social here, and social, it's also the same sort of thing. We all have, most people have social phobias of some sort. And if we stay just within our small families, or we become kind of hermits, that becomes a chronic stress. Humans are meant to be social, but at the same time, if you are overly going out, and you're overly social and not taking the time to retreat, then that can become a chronic stress. And so this whole thing, everything is about finding a balance, but to understand the key point that putting yourself in a situation where there is sort of an acute stress, even though that may be difficult, we should always know that acute stresses, unless, generally speaking, almost 99% of the time, we always overblow what we consider to be a stress, as we all know. But if you can make this sort of leap to have these acute stresses, whether that's speaking now socially, going out and doing something social that you haven't done before, or you have that little bit of social phobia, etc., then you come back and then you recharge. And so all of us have different degrees of being an introvert and an extrovert, and we need to make those leaps. It's sort of that running and returning that we need to make to maintain a healthy life in general. I'm sure all of us can relate to that in some way, in their own way. And for most of us, it's one of these levels that really is the one that is difficult for us. And it's up to you to determine what that is. But it's also important for everyone to look at each level and to see where am I intelligently implementing small stresses that I can retreat from and become stronger from, because it's encoded into our bodies. It's encoded into everything that we are, and it's equal on all these levels, from nutritional, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, social. All of these levels, you become stronger by actively seeking out small stressors that can make you stronger. In science, it's called hormesis. That's the actual technical term for this concept, that these small doses of toxins even can be beneficial. And when you remove them, you actually can get sicker. So that's the concept, and I hope everyone can resonate with, can identify, I guess I should say, with something that I mentioned there. I think that we all need to learn how to identify these things, and I think when we do, I would love to hear people comment on what's turned into a chronic stress that shouldn't be, what acute stresses are part of your life that benefit you, that we can feel that we benefit from. Any comments would be great. And thank you for listening. Have a great